busting myths about pleasure and sexuality.
Consent is something that we talk about in the context of abuse sometimes, but not necessarily in the context of teaching people.
Her content normalizes sex-aware conversations.
What are the different experiences and aspects people are bringing into their experience of sexuality? So that could include the LGBTQ plus community. It could include just exploring one's gender.
NewsX influencer A-List proudly recognizes Karishma Swaroop for influence in sex-positive content creation. Hello and welcome. You're joining us on NewsX Influencer A-List. I'm Parati Bhanot, and with us today is somebody who's talking about sexual education on the internet. With us on the broadcast is Karishma, and Karishma, known on the internet, her Instagram handle is called The Talk That You Never Had. She has over 35,000 followers, and she's been changing how we perceive sex on the internet, and she's helping audiences understand what it means to be comfortable with your bodies. Firstly, Karishma, thank you so much for being with us on NewsX Influencer A-List, and we're glad to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for making space for this conversation on a topic that's pretty taboo and needs to be talked about much more. So thank you so much.
So why don't you first start by telling us, when we talk about sexual education, right, what exactly comes under the ambit of sexual education?
Yeah, that's a very good question, especially because I feel like in India today, we don't have a standardized sex education curriculum that is applied across schools. And so a lot of people have misconceptions around what sex education even means. People seem to think that, just talking about the biology piece that they studied in biology class might be considered sex education. But in reality, sex education is so much more than that. It involves, yes, biology, but from a context of understanding anatomy, understanding, and not the teacher being like, oh, this is out of syllabus, we won't ask you. But, being able to discuss what are your body parts, how do those body parts function, whether or not that's in a sexual situation, right? So that's the first piece of it, just the anatomy bit. The second piece is, of course, the sexual health piece of it. So that involves contraception, how to use a condom, how to prevent STI transmission, just generally how to be safe and have safer sex. But you cannot have any conversation about sex without talking about consent. And consent is something that we talk about in the context of abuse sometimes, but not necessarily in the context of teaching people what is the correct way to have a healthy relationship and what is the correct way to have and ask for consent in a situation. And of course, all of this is also influenced by things like gender and people's personal identities. So good comprehensive sexuality education takes into consideration also what are the different experiences and aspects people are bringing into their experience of sexuality. So that could include the LGBTQ plus community. It could include just exploring one's gender, but it can also include other intersections such as how does your class or your religious background or what you've been told growing up influence how you relate to these concepts. And so comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, is this holistic picture which goes so much more than telling young people to have sex. It is not about telling young people to have sex. And if anything, the countries where they offer CSE at an early age, young people tend to delay their onset of sexual activity rather than do it earlier. And so
tell us a little bit about, your educational background and whether or not, from where you see it, it's important to have a degree in, let's say sexual education to be able to teach it. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these things are very scientific, right, in nature. So what is your understanding on that? Where do you stand as far as doing a formal course is concerned on sexual education?
Yeah. Absolutely. So that's a very good question. I myself have done science my whole life.
Mm.
I did science in school. So I did those biology classes I was referring to, and I went and I studied geology, biology while I was at Brown University as well. But a large bulk of my learning came from working with this NGO named Planned Parenthood, which is a really big organization in the US that offers a lot of different sexual health and reproductive health services, including sex ed. So I was part of a student organization there where we went out and taught sex ed to high school students in the area. And so working with them meant that I got 3 years of field experience working there. I got trained by this NGO who had years and years of grassroots teaching experience, right? And I think it goes beyond a question of do you have a degree or not? Especially with sexual health, it's a topic that is so ignored, so widely ignored around the world in most places that really it's a question of who's doing it and have they been doing it for a long time? And if they have, then that knowledge is also of a lot of value. And so I did 3 years there, and then I was also working with a school in Calcutta when I was coming back home for breaks. And after that, I started to explore the space here. So I worked as a teacher for a year in the US, also in the middle. And I was working with 12, 13-year-olds. And you have to, the more you work with young people, the more you realize how much this information is required, right? And so I came back to India because of the pandemic.
What is the stark difference?
Yeah.
Sorry for cutting you off, but what is the stark difference, that you have seen in the United States when you were, let's say, on the ground versus here on the ground? What is the ground reality like? Help us understand that, Karishma.
Right. So, okay, I'll start by saying that a lot of the same questions come up. A lot of the exact same questions come up. I used to think that I needed a whole new set of skills to be able to do this work here because some of it is context dependent and culture dependent and whatnot. But I really found that the same questions come up. People are equally mystified by the vagina, or people are equally curious about ways to not get pregnant or whatever that might be, right? And I think part of it is that there is a lot of cultural exchange that happens between the US and India. So urban youth, especially in India, English speaking youth end up seeing the same media, internalizing the same ideas that youth there as well are doing. But I guess the big difference was that those conversations I was having with high school students, and here in India doing that work through Instagram, I discovered that the same information is required for college students as well as for people who are far outside college. I have people sometimes attending my workshop who are in their late 20s, in their 30s. I've spoken to married people because it's the talk you never got, right? Most people never got this talk. And so that's what I would say is the difference. When
let's say, we talk about sexual education, right? Especially on the internet. What is the reach like? Because now, of course, the internet audience is an audience that has, let's say, they have access to a phone, they have access to the internet, right? So the audience that is there on the internet is a relatively smaller audience, right? Versus there are people on the ground also, people that don't have access to internet that need this kind of understanding. They need sex education, to be very honest. So what is the reach like, And Karishma, do you plan on, let's say, reaching out to people that do not have access to the online medium also?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work I do is offline. I mean, with the pandemic, offline also means through Zoom, through things like that. And so the populations I work with have been largely youth. So youth in various age groups, in high school age groups, in college age groups, things like that. But also I've worked with NGOs who want to do a session with their students. And Yeah, I would say because of COVID, my reach has been limited, but there are a lot of NGOs in India who are doing this work in a grassroots way, maybe on pause because of COVID, but who like go out and do this work in schools,
Yeah.
in rural areas, in and also sometimes through the entry point being menstrual health education. I feel like we've seen a lot of um, organizations come up to do that in the last few years.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely awesome. It's been really interesting, Karishma, speaking with you, and we're so glad that we could have this conversation. Thank you so much for being on NewsX Influencer A List, and more about you and the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. And follow me at Talk You Never Got on Instagram.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.